everybody so much for joining Switch Colorado this evening, our virtual networking panel. Some of you may not be familiar with Switch, but we have a few event groups across the country that work to bring together energy communities and colleagues to network and share ideas on the energy transition. While we usually have these events in person, we, like many others, have had to shift in times of COVID. What we haven't shifted, however, is our goal of bringing an engaging, interesting, and entertaining event to the energy community. We are so excited that the event is finally here, and we are so grateful to the incredible panel that has donated their time with us tonight. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback in the breakout groups after the event. The Switch Colorado team and myself were particularly motivated to continue the education and networking of Switch in a time of incredible political and community friction. We wanted to put out an event that was both insightful and brought attention to a topic that should be at the forefront of the energy community's mind: how to achieve a just energy transition. When we use the word justice, the implication is for whom? The Switch Colorado answer is for everybody, but we acknowledge that historically, the negative environmental and societal impacts of energy transitions have disproportionately impacted communities of color, poor communities, and rural communities. While we hope to have a broad and inclusive conversation through our panel today, we acknowledge that we may not represent all communities during this event, which is something that Switch Colorado will strive to improve for the future. That said, energy justice is something that, regardless of background or circumstance, we all need to be talking about. And our esteemed panelists are experts in the field of energy policy, and we'll have an awesome conversation today on the just energy transition. Because energy and a just energy transition is so dependent on local, state, and federal policy, one of the best ways we can create the just energy transition that you want is to vote. This event today is more than just a discussion. We all have a civic duty to vote the world we want into existence, and we hope to encourage you all here tonight to do so. We want to remind those of you in Colorado that you can legally register in the state to vote until the day of the election, November 3rd. And we encourage any of you joining us from elsewhere to check your state's registration deadline and to make a plan to vote if you have not so already. Also, through this event, Switch is matching donations made to New Era Colorado, an organization that is working to turn out the youth vote in the state. And we encourage you to donate at the link just shared in the chat box. A few key tips for our audience tonight. Please keep your video and microphone off throughout the panel discussion. You may turn these on during the networking event afterwards. We do ask you to submit questions in the panel box. We will be filtering these so the moderator can check on these throughout the event, but this will be the platform through which we ask you to ask questions. As for the order of this event, I will shortly hand it off to Taylor Kirkendall from S&P Global, our awesome moderator for the evening, who will lead the panel through a discussion for the next 30-ish minutes, with the rest of the hour being left for Q&A. After the panel discussion, we will be using Zoom to put us all into breakout rooms to have facilitated discussions on a just energy transition and the panel event. Before we dig in, we would love to get to know all of you who are participating in our event tonight, and we have some polling questions ready for you. On your screen, you should see the first one pop up shortly. And we want to know, on a scale from 1 to 5, how much does climate change influence your vote? Give you a couple minutes to respond, or a couple seconds here. We would also like to know, which aspect of the energy transition are you most excited about in our next polling question? Oh, sorry, jumped ahead of ourselves a little bit. Here are the results from the first one. And of course, as expected, with a huge energy transition panel like this, there's a lot of motivation to focus on climate change as we move into our next political realm. So what aspect of the energy transition are you all most excited about? Diversity, renewable energy, better air quality, or jobs? Not surprisingly, I think also a lot of renewable energy, though I'm excited to see jobs and air quality being encompassed in that as well. I think it's going to be really exciting as we talk about a just energy transition here tonight. And finally, we want to know, what industry do you work in? Consulting, engineering, law, government, or academia? Looks like we have a lot of consultants in the room. We're excited to see how you guys all think of this new problem that's in front of us. And we're excited to hear all of your feedback about the event afterwards in our breakout discussions. And with that, I'll hand it off to Taylor for the panel discussion. Thank you all.
Hey, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm Taylor Kirkendall. I'm a senior reporter covering energy and mining for S&P Global Market Intelligence. I also co-host a podcast called Energy Evolution, talks a lot about these same topics. But I'll be your moderator today. Joining me is an excellent panel of experts. They're ready to talk about energy and the environment, and particularly our key theme today, which is energy policy for a just transition. So let's talk about the panelists. First up, that's Ann Hitt. She is the National Director of Campaigns for the Sierra Club. She's played a major role in the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign. That's a movement that's pushed the wave of coal plant retirements that we've seen come to fruition in recent years. We also have Colorado State Senator Chris Hansen. He sponsored a range of energy and environmental legislation in just the past few years, including bills that are aimed at enhancing access to electric cars, providing financial tools for retiring coal plants, and setting clean energy targets for investor-owned utilities in Colorado. Our final panelist with us today, Dwayne Hiley. He's the CEO of the Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association. Earlier this year, the company announced it would retire all of its coal generation in Colorado and New Mexico by 2030, and they're going to be replacing that generation with renewable energy capacity. So in short, what we have here are some of the people that are on the front lines of the transition to the renewable energy that's going on all across the country and really around the world. We're glad that you could join us for this virtual event, wherever you happen to be in the world today, but let's get started. So I think we want to start off talking about what is energy justice or environmental justice. It's this idea that when we create, maintain, or expand energy systems, each project should take into consideration the environmental and social impacts beyond simply providing energy to consumers. It's a really big term, and a lot of people define it differently. Specifically, though, what we want to talk about is energy justice in the context of that transition as we go from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So to kick it off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists the same question. We'll start with Ann Hitt. What I want to ask is, what aspects of energy justice are most relevant to your current role, and what experience do you have in engaging on the social side of energy systems?
Well, first of all, thank you, Switch Colorado, for hosting us. And I'm very pleased to be here with my fellow panelists. And I am the National Director of Campaigns at Sierra Club after 10 years of leading our Beyond Coal campaign. I also live in West Virginia and have spent most of my life and my environmental career working in Appalachia. And so when I think about a just energy transition, I think of a couple of things. I think one, first and foremost, is not leaving behind the people who have powered our country for decades, in coal mining communities and power plant communities, both the workers and the communities that have relied on those industries for their tax base. And so not leaving those folks behind is a big, something that I care about very deeply as someone in Appalachia. It also means that we have to make sure the clean energy solutions are not out of reach for low income folks. So it means making that clean energy that's coming online affordable. And finally, not creating pollution hotspots in communities of color. Our fossil fuel coal and gas infrastructure has led to a lot of disproportionate impacts in communities of color. And we're seeing that now with the higher COVID rates in those communities because of the chronic exposure to pollution. And so as we clean up our energy system, we need to make sure that the benefits go to those low income folks who may be struggling to pay their bills, and also to folks who are living with the legacy of fossil fuel pollution that is time to clean up.
Thank you. And Chris, I'd like to ask you the same question. What aspects of energy justice are most relevant to your current role? And tell me about your experience on seeing the social side of energy systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mary Ann, I think you did a great job of summarizing. I was jotting down my 2 points, and you covered them exactly. I mean, number one in Colorado, and we've been working on this for many years, thinking about legislative options. I started with some bills in 2017. We did a lot of stakeholder work with folks like Tri-State and Excel and the big companies in the state, as well as Sierra Club and the environmental groups. And I think we got to a great place in 2019 where we started to really be one of the leading states that is going to work hard on helping workers and communities transition. We have funding, we have financial mechanisms to make sure we're not leaving people behind. And historically, the United States has done a pretty terrible job at this. If you think about, the demise of say, textile industry, some of the Rust Belt cities, like the reduction in tobacco farming, right? There's been a bunch of examples we can think of historical transitions from one industry to the next. And we have not done a great job of helping people cross that chasm that occurs when you have big transitions like that. And so I'm really proud of the work we've been able to collectively do in Colorado to anticipate this, get ready for it, and have the resources available to help the workers and communities adjust. And I know we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. The second quick thing to mention is just we have a terrible legacy of pollution being concentrated in low income and communities of color. That is absolutely true in Colorado. And part of the important work we have to do in the future is to drastically change that history. And I think we've made some good progress, but we've got a lot of work ahead of us on that front.
Thank you very much. And yes, we certainly are going to dive into a lot of these topics very shortly. Dwayne, before we move on to that, though, I would like to hear your experience on this. Coming from the power generation side, how is energy justice relevant to your current role, and tell us a little bit about your experience on the social side of energy systems.
Well, thank you, Taylor and Senator Mary Ann. So privileged to be able to share this evening with you. I've got 38 years of experience with electric cooperatives. If you go back to 1982, whenever I took that job out of college and chose to work with cooperatives because I believed in their purpose. If you look at the reason why co-ops were formed in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, it was for energy justice. It was to bring power to rural communities that couldn't get it. And that's still our mission today, reliable and affordable energy. The people we serve in rural America are some of the poorest and most economically challenged. And in this time of COVID, it's even more so. We've got a lot of people who can't even pay their electric bills. So we think real seriously about our mission. Mission's three basic words: reliable, affordable, responsible energy. And it's in that order for a reason. Reliability comes first. We just witnessed that today, standing out in the area of the wildfires and talking with some of our crews who are trying to restore power. I mean, it's devastating. So we have to have electricity first and foremost, reliable, and then as soon as it's on, everybody wants it to be affordable, and that's because of the people whom we're serving that are most economically challenged in those rural areas.
Thank you. And while we're on that, let's talk about a little bit about the path on how we get there. And first, Mary Ann, this question's for you to start with. This transition, it obviously means a lot of new projects and jobs and renewables, things to get excited about, but it also means getting rid of a lot of older energy infrastructure, namely coal, other fossil fuels. But a few years ago, the Sierra Club set a goal. They were trying to get to 0 U.S. coal plants by 2030. As someone covering that, it feels like we're hearing about new announcements just every couple of days. But the goal's now less than a decade away. Are we on track to hit the goal? And then beyond that, what does that maybe timeline look like for natural gas and other fossil fuels?
We are on track to hit that goal, and it is because of course now we have renewable energy that is cheaper than coal in just about every part of the country. But we also have had regular folks in their communities who've been living with coal pollution, who have been really concerned about climate change for a decade, working steadily to get a power grid powered by 100% clean energy. And just to give you a sense of the speed at which this is happening, there were 530 coal plants on the grid a decade ago, providing half of our electricity. We now have reached the milestone of 60% of those coal plants retired or announced to retire. And just to put it in perspective for you, so we were getting half of our electricity from coal. In a 3-year period from 2016 to 2019, that had come down, and we went from 30% of our electricity from coal to 25%. So that was a 3-year drop from 30% of our power from coal to 25%. We then did the next 5% increment in 9 months, from 25% of our electricity to 20% of our electricity. So a drop in coal contributing to our electric grid that took 3 years, then took 9 months following that. And just to make the case that this has continued in the current presidential administration, and it's because, yes, because of economics, but it's also because climate change has landed on people's doorsteps and they want clean energy, and because the connections between air pollution and water pollution and public health are especially with this COVID crisis, really stark for folks. And for gas, our goal there is to leapfrog over gas as fast as we possibly can. We don't think building new gas is the right solution in a world faced with a climate crisis and a public health crisis. And we've done work with Rocky Mountain Institute on clean energy portfolios that show that a suite of clean energy solutions can provide the same services as new gas and do so affordably all across the country. And so I think we'll be there in 2030. I think we will have a power grid where we no longer have coal plants on the grid, and we can get to 100% clean energy by 2030 or 2035. And again, the topic here, just transition. That's the underlying current through it all, is we have to do all of that in a way that doesn't leave folks behind.
Sure. And so let's move this back to Dwayne for a second, because Tri-State, you're in the middle of a big transition right now. And I think it would be fair to say that a lot of the panelists and maybe even some of the guests would like to see a transition from coal to renewables happen even faster than the timelines you're set. But can you tell us just a little bit about what you're doing and what you would like people to understand about maybe the challenges of making that transition?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it, and thanks for the question. So when you look at the Tri-State's Responsible Energy Plan, it involves dramatic reduction in emissions, big improvement and increase in renewable build out, 1,000 megawatts between now and 2024, that pushes our renewable percentage to 50% across all 4 states in which we serve. And then the retirement of all our coal in New Mexico and Colorado, which has already started. And by the time we get to the end of the decade, that'll be a 90% decarbonization within the state of Colorado. We're also working to minimize that imported energy that's still left over that comes in to make Colorado reliable. But I do remind you that, primary challenge for us is reliability, and getting through a week like we've just seen, where the wind turbines were not blowing 2 days ago when the ice storm came through Colorado. And so we have to make sure we have dispatchable energy resources, and those may be a form of storage as we get towards the end of the decade. But that's the challenge for us, is we cannot let the lights go out. We can't leave people in the dark. And so we've got to make sure that whatever we plan to do will operate through any circumstance and any kind of weather. I'd also say we're grateful for the state allowing us to incorporate into the regional haze rulemaking our voluntary closure of the Craig plant, which will help us to exceed the reductions that are called for in 1261 for carbon dioxide reductions.
Now, Senator, I know you've thought about these kind of things a lot. Tell me a little bit about what's going on in Colorado as far as policymakers trying to help coal plants along, help power generators along with this energy transition. And are they doing enough in Colorado, and are they doing enough at a federal level maybe to help make this transition happen?
Well, yeah, I'll take the last piece of that. I mean, I think the federal government has not clearly helped at all in the last 4 years with this transition. In fact, they've gone the opposite direction. And it's obviously one of the things on the ballot that we all get to decide here on November 3rd. But I would say that has led to a huge amount of state leadership. And I think we can safely say that Colorado has been one of those leading 4 or 5 states around the country to move aggressively. We passed, arguably the biggest set of changes in 2019 in state history to rapidly move us down the path that Dwayne just described. You're seeing similar announcements from Dwayne's peers, Excel, Black Hills, moving to make these changes. Now, we got to implement it. We got to have it be done in a reliable way. We have to have it done in an affordable way, to all the points that were just made. So we've got lots of work ahead of us, but I think the template is there. The technology is there, and together we can do this. And I just wanted to kind of to draw a link to something you started with your question, Taylor, which was get rid of the coal facilities. And I would just maybe add a slight bit of nuance to that, because I think there's a really interesting story of how we could repurpose some of that infrastructure, the transmission, some of the sites that are available. And I'm super excited about the green hydrogen story because, Dwayne mentioned storage. One of the ways you can store power, of course, are batteries. Another way is to take excess renewables, turn it into hydrogen, use it the next day, use it the next week. And that's a great way to reuse that transmission asset and that footprint and really help those communities not lose a big piece of that tax base. So I think this transition presents a whole bunch of new doors that are opening. Yes, we're going to retire those coal plants, but now we can repurpose those facilities and that infrastructure and really help speed up this transition.
Excellent. And before we move on, Dwayne, is that something that you think you and your peers could get behind, this idea of repurposing some of that infrastructure? Yeah. And if so, what do you need from policymakers to make that happen?
Well, absolutely. And in part, the Tri-State Board's already doing that with the retirement of the Escalante plant in New Mexico and the loss of a couple hundred jobs. We've also announced the reinvestment of a 200 megawatt, roughly $200 million solar project there on that site. We're announcing the investment of 120 megawatts as the first stage of renewable investment at Craig, Colorado, along with partnership with Electric Power Research Institute on indoor agriculture demonstration projects at both those locations. So we're trying to shift the workforce to maintain that technically skilled workforce into another technically skilled area of beneficial electrification. And as we do that, we see an enormous role, just as the senator said. Those sites have big transmission facilities. They were designed as baseload transmission facilities. They're the perfect places to reinvest in storage. And we're very interested in collaborating with the partners right here on this call with me. I'm looking, I guess, on my screen, you're this way. But if we can work together on this, we can demonstrate Colorado as a leader in the nation, and everybody's looking at us and how we're going to do this. But we can work together and make these energy storage work. And I think there's policy issues, Senator, we got to work on that. And Marianne, we've got, I think we can work together with the NGOs and the studies that have been done with RMI. They demonstrate that things are possible. We're eager to sit down and figure out how we can take, maybe we can spend a little less money on litigation and put some of that money into a storage project in Craig, Colorado. That'd be great.
I'm glad you bring that up, and this transitions perfectly into our next topic. We've got people from some very different sectors of all this issue here. And I want to know what each of you would like each other to know about what's going on here in the energy transition. And since you mentioned some of the work the Sierra Club's doing with through Marianne, I'd like you to start. Can you kind of respond to that a little bit and maybe talk about what needs to be done to collaborate here, maybe between all these groups and other stakeholders?
Yeah, I think that the Sierra Club is the nation's largest grassroots environmental organization. We've got 4 million members and supporters. We've got chapters in every state and groups in most cities in the country. And those folks are, and then just in the Beyond Coal campaign, we worked with 300 different partner organizations all across the country. Because as you all know, decisions about how we produce electricity in this country are made at the state level and the local level primarily. And folks are passionate about clean air, about clean water, about environmental justice, about the economic opportunities that renewable energy creates, and the fact that it now is a more affordable electricity option in most parts of the country, and the climate crisis. And so I think, when we are litigating, when we are pushing, when we are advocating, we are doing so on behalf of our members and supporters and partners who often don't have the same kind of access to decision makers or the same kind of a seat at the table that sometimes folks who run our electric utilities or folks in government have. And I think that it's a vital part of our democracy for us to bring those voices forward and advocate for those families and communities. And we do very much see a path forward here that works for families, works for communities, works for our economy, and works for our climate. And having worked on this issue for 10 years, when we started doing this work, the big electric utilities and the coal industry were very reluctant to embrace change. And that was why we had to litigate and why we had to hold folks accountable. And now change is happening. And so I think we're very eager to when our goals are aligned and our values are aligned to make good things happen. And when we see folks that are still dragging their feet, we will keep pushing for, on behalf of all the folks that we represent. And the last piece I would say is that a just transition is very important to us at the Sierra Club too. We have members in Wyoming and West Virginia and all of these states that are struggling a lot with this transition. And it is a very core piece of solving the climate crisis for a lot of us.
Thank you. And then Dwayne, anything you would respond to that, or just anything else that you would add in terms of what you hope either groups like the Sierra Club or maybe lawmakers like Senator Hansen understand about your position in the energy transition?
Yeah, so cooperatives are member owned, and we basically, are going to take the direction from our membership and what they've asked as far as a cleaner grid. And if you can go back to the co-ops I was working with, when Al Gore was vice president and promoting a cap and trade system, actually our co-op was the first electric utility to join the Chicago Climate Exchange and engage in carbon emissions trading. So we have the experience of that maybe is greater than others. We're definitely embracing this change because our members want us to, and we respond to them. And my opinion is we're moving at light speed. I know it sometimes seems like utilities move slowly. That's because the facilities we build last for decades, and it takes a while to get them built. It can take 10 years to build a transmission line. And so we have to do things with a long-term view. But in my opinion, in my time in this industry, at this point in time, we're moving at light speed in the transition.
And Senator, anything that you would like to add about your state lawmakers' role in maybe helping facilitate some of these, either whether it's the conversations or the actual action to making the energy transition happen?
Well, yeah, Taylor, I have kind of felt, this is why I left my job and ran for office, was to work on exactly what we're talking about tonight. I financially, clearly the dumbest thing I've ever done, but I get to work with great people like Mary Ann and Dwayne and stakeholders and work on these conversations and these tough puzzles. No single person involved has the answer. We've got to come together and figure out these really complex puzzles. And I think, there's often this phrase, the Colorado way. I think we've done this in a relatively bipartisan way over the last few years to think about these puzzles, think about what's going to work, talking to, Republican county commissioners in the places where these coal plants are operating and trying to figure out, okay, how do we make sure we protect your communities, give the resources that are needed, rebuild the tax base. As Dwayne was mentioning with some of their investments, that's what we're trying to do. And it's hard work, it's tough work, but goodness sakes, if this fire season didn't bring home the point of how urgent it is that we tackle climate change, what else is going to do it? We are having massive fires on Halloween. Folks, we gotta move quick. It's the fierce urgency of now.
Excellent point. And to go back to some more of this on the economic side of the energy transition, as someone who mostly watches the coal industry really closely, and also someone from West Virginia, I tend to think of West Virginia as an example of where there was maybe that a transition's not been handled so well. There hasn't been a lot of thinking about what's going to come next after coal. And I know that, Mary Ann, you mentioned that as an example at the top of the show. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more, not so much what was done wrong, but maybe what can be learned from the state and what maybe other states like maybe Colorado might be thinking about in terms of lessons to be learned in making their own energy transition.
Absolutely. I think if with proper planning and with a utility that is willing to put in the effort, and we've seen this in Colorado, that coal plant workers and operators and communities can be taken care of and made whole in this process of a transition. And my hat's off to Colorado for planning for the transition, for seeing it coming. And Senator Hansen, thank you for all your leadership, for seeing it coming and planning for it, rather than putting your head in the sand and then being caught off guard. When you have communities that are dependent on coal mining, as we have a lot of here in West Virginia or in Wyoming, the Illinois Basin, there I think the transition challenge is much bigger, and they're both economically and politically. And there, I think we really need federal leadership. We need legislation like the Reclaim Act or other similar, efforts at the federal level to step in at the scale that, frankly, NGOs, civil society, philanthropy just can't match. And so when it comes to the mining communities, I think that's the kind of leadership that we need. One thing perhaps Senator Hansen wants to talk about more that we have passed in Colorado is securitization legislation, which basically, looking at the coal plants, takes into account how much, sort of, if you think about the mortgage of a house, how much left do you have to pay off of your mortgage, and can you kind of change the terms of your mortgage so that you can pay that off faster on your coal plant and retire it sooner, and then take that savings and reinvest it in economic transition, reinvest it in renewable energy, reinvest it in the communities where the coal plant was located. And so I think we've seen, with the Drake and Nixon plants in Colorado, at the Comanche plants, I think we've seen good work by the utilities and good work by lawmakers to actually put together the solutions that help those communities and workers have a path forward. And that is certainly something that we could see more of across the country. And that really does depend on the leadership of states and utilities. And where that federal leadership is just critical is around the mining transition, in my experience.
Yeah, and so I would like to maybe get into securitization a little bit, but let's see if we can maybe work it into this conversation that I want to pose to each of you. So in terms of this just transition outcomes, speaking from the role that you're in right now, can you tell me just some of the top priorities of what you hope to accomplish in the next 5 years? And let's start with you, Senator Hansen, since we did bring up securitization, as that might be one of your goals.
Yeah, well, I just want to say, without Sierra Club's help in 2019, we would not have passed that legislation at the fullness of its coverage as we did. I mean, it was absolutely vital partnerships that we built to get that legislation done. And, securitization is kind of like, redoing your mortgage. That's exactly right. We refinance the remaining value, the stranded asset, if you will, that is left over when you decide to retire a coal plant that hasn't been totally paid off. We refinance that with AAA commercial debt, which right now is like, 2.5%, very, very low rates. And the customers come out way ahead, because typically with a investor-owned utility coal plant, the customers are paying 7 to 8% return on those assets. So it's a huge savings, and we can then take a bunch of that savings and use it to help the workers, help the communities, buttress the property tax shortfall that occurs after retirement. All of those issues now we've got resource. And so when you say, what is my top goal? It's to make sure that we've got adequate resources to fund the just transition work in Colorado. That has to be done. We created the office in 2019, but we didn't have a clear funding source. Securitization is one of those ways to fund it. I'm also looking next year at having a sustainable funding level to make sure we pay for that work. Because 2 guys in an office and a laptop is not going to do it. We need millions of dollars directed to help the state transition.
And Dwayne, what about you? The next 5 years, what's your top goal in terms of energy transition?
I guess I'll just mention securitization because it was mentioned earlier that for co-ops and public power like municipals, we already can access that debt at those really attractive prices in the low 2% range. So the securitization does not help us. But one thing we are working with, and Sierra Club's helping us with this right now, is a conversation in DC about help with stranded assets and help with early retirement of debt that's held by cooperatives and public power. So we're grateful for that partnership. We think that's one of the keys. Like I said, for us, 5 years is a blink of an eye. That's tomorrow. So by 2025, we're going to be 50% renewable across all 4 states in which we operate, and moving towards 70 and 80% and beyond by the end of the decade. And the other thing we're going to need by 2025 is we're going to have a regional transmission organization with a Western market in place. Because as we move beyond 50% renewable and to try and integrate those higher percentages, we have to do it over a broader and broader geographic area. We especially need the ability to move that power east and west into different time zones. And that's something that a regional transmission organization can help us with in terms of the build out across multiple balancing areas, multiple utilities. We need something bigger than us to make this happen. And it's an area that Tri-State's moving forward with great haste.
Thank you. And I want to make sure that we get to our question and answer session. So let's keep this next question about 1 minute apiece, but an easy one, kind of. If you were building the next utility completely from scratch in the next 5 years, what would that energy mix look like? And what would be some maybe issues that you would make sure that you would focus on when you're building this out? Let's start with you, Miriam.
Well, surprising no one, it would be 100% clean energy, renewables, storage, demand response, that whole package of clean energy portfolio solutions that I mentioned, as well as a focus on electrifying everything. I think utilities have a big role to play as we not only power this nation with 100% clean energy, but electrify our buildings and our transportation. And then supporting low-income customers and making sure that they benefit from that transition, that we clean up the legacy pollution sites. And last, but certainly not least, that utility would be a strong advocate for having our national climate energy policy really focus on accelerating this transition and making it just and fair, rather than bailing out the fossil fuel industry and continuing to subsidize them.
Excellent. Dwayne?
Well, I think we're doing it now. I mean, the decision horizon we have to get within 10 years is decisions we have to make today. I mentioned transmission lines. If we're going to start a transmission project for 2030, we need to be starting it right now. And so the decisions we're making right now are determining where we're going, and we're doing just what Mary Ann said. We're looking at all those options: beneficial electrification, demand response, and then I think one of the bigger question marks to answer in the next few years is, what's that long-term storage technology look like? Is it hydrogen? Is it ammonia? Is it flow batteries? What is the one that's going to win and be the cost-effective path for us to take?
Yeah,
you can see my demand response. The lights keep going off in the office to save energy.
Glad to see you've got those set up in your office, Dwayne.
Yeah.
Great demonstration.
Yeah, Taylor, I would just quickly add, I want to reinforce the point that Dwayne started with the RTO. It is absolutely critical that we get an integrated Western grid and an integrated national grid to meet our climate goals. I think we're seeing some of the problems in California right now because we have not done a better job of integration. If you can believe this, the 11 Western states have 38 separate power grids. It makes absolutely no economic sense. And it certainly makes no sense for the environment because it is leading to much higher emissions levels, and it's going to make it hard to decarbonize, get to 100% clean if we don't integrate the grid. So I kind of see it as top-down integration of the Western grid and eventually the national grid, and then bottom-up integration of dispatchable load, DERs, batteries, all the great stuff that we're doing at the local level. But we need both. We got to come from both directions to do deep decarbonization.
Excellent. All right, so let's turn to the question and answer session. We have quite a few questions that have come in from the audience, and several that were sent in when they first sent in the tickets. Our first one's from Bill Johnson. It's, do you think an official national coal phase out date of 2030, that's similar to what European nations and some US states have had, is an important part of working towards that goal? And I'll start with you, Senator.
Yes, I mean, I think we can get there by 2030. I think nationally we will be done with coal in and around 2030. I think we have to be for the fate of our planet. But in addition, it's the right economic decision. Like, even if you didn't care about climate change at all, it makes sense to stop using coal, because we are now seeing $17 fixed price for wind and solar contracts. The marginal cost of an existing coal plant averages out at about $30 to $35, assuming they have low-cost coal reserves. So it's way more expensive, almost double, and wind and solar are going to keep getting cheaper. Coal is not. And so this is a no-brainer from an economic standpoint, and it's absolutely a no-brainer from a climate standpoint.
And Mary Ann, to that degree, that lines up with the goal the Sierra Club had. How important is it to get the government behind that goal as well, or is this going to happen regardless?
I believe it will happen regardless because of what Senator Hansen just mentioned. And I think what you've seen in the states that have passed this kind of legislation or over in Europe, when they actually pass a whole package that includes a much more robust transition plan for workers and communities, because they're looking ahead and they're planning versus sticking their head in the sand. And so I think that in not having some kind of either a 100% clean energy standard or a phase out of coal standard, that we're missing the opportunity, I think, to have a robust transition built into that. And that is something that we could do as a nation.
And Dwayne, I have one specifically for you here. A member of our audience, Ross Mazur, I believe, says, what energy storage technology mix is Tri-State planning to implement? And do you have any sort of planned timeline benchmarks, whether that's a certain amount of megawatt hours installed by some date?
So for Tri-State specifically, we're going to need some kind of a storage technology by the end of 2030 to be in place to serve that 2030 summer peak load. And we're actively exploring those alternatives right now. It needs to be dispatchable. It needs to be dispatchable over a long time horizon. Right now, the reliability we get from a coal pile is there because there's no supply chain risk. We can have a 7 to 30 day supply of fuel on the ground at the plant. And when we go through these bomb cyclone type events, or when there's lots of ice and wind and not much sunshine, We need something that'll run not just for 4 hours or 8 hours or even 16 hours, but maybe for 2 or 3 days of storage to keep the grid reliable and keep the lights on. So that's something we're actively exploring. I can't say that we've selected any one technology. The ones we're most excited about, I mean, there's lithium-ion batteries, but they have a very escalating cost curve as you increase the size of the battery. So we're more interested in looking at what happens with hydrogen, and we think we have 3 or 4 years to make that decision before we have to start committing real money towards that answer.
Thank you. And we have another question here. This is from Kevin, and I'm not sure if he wanted it to the whole group or if he had someone specifically in mind. But I'm thinking, Senator, what are your thoughts on the new green or the Green New Deal, or a similar piece of just large sweeping federal climate action that that goes at like an economic and infrastructure plan? He references, an example, one that Governor Jay Inslee from Washington proposed in the 2019 during the primary. Do you see that as a vital part of this transition?
Well, I think what Vice President Biden did as he went into the general election was I think a great emphasis on job creation, reinvestment, and recovery. And I think that's exactly what this green transition can lead for the country as we come out of the pandemic, as we try to reinvigorate the economy. And he said, we want to spend trillions on green infrastructure, and that makes a ton of sense to me. Look, I'm an unabashed Keynesian for one thing. We need government to spend on stimulus to help the economy recover. If we're going to do that, let's do it in the most green possible way we can. Let's build a super highway for electrons and a modern grid for the country. Let's heavily invest in wind and solar and R&D for the new storage technology we were just talking about. That makes a ton of sense. We are going to not only help us recover in the short term, but then have massive climate and economic dividends in the years to come. So I think that is a great plan, and I was really pleased to see Vice President Biden take that, some ideas from Inslee, some ideas from the Green New Deal, and incorporate that directly into his platform. And I'm certainly hopeful in January we can get hard to work on that direction.
Excellent. And Dwayne, we have another one coming in following up to Ross's question, this one from Stuart Cummings. He wants to know if there's any consideration of Gen 4 advanced nuclear in the future of the energy mix. He says he's been reading some articles that says we can't really get to our climate targets without it. What do you think?
I agree that there's a role for nuclear in the long-term climate targets. I can't think of any utility that's going to bet on a conventional large PWR kind of, multi-billion-dollar project again after the experience with Vodal. But I do think small modular reactors are very interesting. They won't be ready, I don't think, by the end of this decade for wide-scale deployment. They won't solve our problem by 2030, in other words. It's going to take some other technology, but I do think they can play a significant role in the mid-2030s to 2040. There's some advanced cycle nuclear projects that are just awarded by DOE. Those are 15 years out or maybe 20. The project in Utah with the municipals of small modular reactors under PWR technology is fascinating. I'm not sure they're going to achieve their price target, and it could be that renewables are still going to beat that price once we see what that really looks like. That'll be up and running possibly by the end of this decade.
And this one's for Mary Ann. This is from Bobby Isley, I believe. You mentioned earlier that we might leapfrog our reliance on natural gas. She'd like to discuss the role that batteries play on phasing out natural gas, and when you think that the energy density technology will be there to take over. Also, are lawmakers thinking enough about how crucial batteries might play in this energy transition?
We are seeing all over the country wind and solar with storage, but just solar with storage out competing existing coal plants. And that's in Colorado, it's in Indiana, it's in Michigan. It's pretty widespread at this point when utilities go out and solicit competitive bids for their energy needs, obviously places like California. And so I think we are at the point where not only is it competitive, but the competitiveness of the storage technology is just going to increase because the innovation is going to increase. More people are going to adopt the technology, more utilities are going to adopt that technology. That's going to continue to drive the price down and drive the innovation where it gets more efficient, more powerful. And so in our view at the Sierra Club, we think the era of building new gas plants needs to come to an end. And we actually think that utilities that do build new gas plants are in real danger of saddling their customers with something that will quickly become, just as the coal plants are today, what we call a stranded asset, something that is much more expensive than the clean alternatives on the market. And the customers there will be left paying the bill for this gas plant that quickly got eclipsed by clean energy. I can't say that I'm an expert on how the lawmakers are viewing battery technology. Maybe Senator Hansen can speak to that one. But it's certainly, there are a lot of states that are looking at solar with storage and batteries coming in a bigger way, and I'm sure are grappling with that on the lawmaker side.
That would be a great point. Senator Hansen, is that something that you guys are talking about?
Yeah, very much so. I've been running a piece of storage legislation basically every year since I came to the Capitol. I'll continue to do so. I've got a proposal next year that would put storage investments have the same tax treatment as renewable energy investments, so they're congruent. Right now, storage investment is treated, or storage property is treated the same as like a normal building or anything else. I think we could really accelerate investment if we move down the path of congruent tax treatment between renewables and batteries. The other thing I'm trying to do is make sure that the green hydrogen option is available in Colorado, and that create clear market demand for that type of storage technology. And so I've got a bill that is really focused on methane capture and destruction that is incorporated green hydrogen into those targets. And I think that's a way we can really create a clear market signal to get that investment, just like we did with the RPS, where it was 10% in Colorado, then 20, now 30. Now we don't even talk about the RPS, right? The market's been created, the prices have come down, and I think some similar tools could really help us accelerate the storage story and the green hydrogen story.
I have another quick specific question for Dwayne, and let's just turn into another topic that it's kind of been gaining some traction lately. It's definitely something we're writing a lot about at S&P. What is Tri-State doing, or maybe planning to help accelerate the kind of building electrification that might help into this energy transition?
Right. So, I mean, as an energy supplier, one of the things we do is offer rebates on the high efficiency appliances. But the other thing we like to do is demonstrate those technologies. And of course, we're talking about beneficial electrification in terms of the transportation sector, because as we get our grid greener and get to 50%, 60%, 70%, then it makes a lot of sense to move the fossil fuel transportation industry over to electrification. And one of the greatest opportunities there is these like school buses or trash trucks or anything that runs the same route every day. You can perfectly size the battery to that vehicle, and you don't have a range anxiety issue. You know exactly what you're running, the same route. Delivery vehicles like you're seeing with Amazon's announcement. It's a mutually complementary opportunity for both the industries.
And actually, I'd like to get the other two panelists' thoughts on this too. What's the Sierra Club's thinking on building electrification? That's obviously a way that a lot of people don't think about meeting climate goals, at least most people on the street. What's your take on building electrification?
We have an incredible leader, Rachel Golden, who is leading our building electrification campaign, and we have been part of passing 30 different local ordinances all across California, calling for all electric new construction and various iterations of that, because we see building electrification not only as an important climate solution, but also as an important way to address energy burden, to address low income households that pay a lot for their electricity compared to their income, and getting their homes more efficient and getting those cleaner appliances both cleans up the indoor air pollution in those homes that we know now from gas stoves are quite high, and also reduces their energy bills. So it's a win-win. And we are expanding that work now into several states, and it's something a lot of communities are very excited to embrace. And if you think about the big picture on climate, we need a 100% clean energy grid. We need to electrify our transportation, and we have to electrify our buildings. That's, other than the industrial sector, those are the big sectors that we need to move on, and we need to move on fast. And we think there's a lot of exciting opportunities there.
And Senator, anything you would add, either specifically about Colorado or just building electrification in general and its role in the transition?
Yeah, I would just say that those topics will be front and center in this session coming up starting in January. We are looking at a beneficial electrification bill, building electrification. There's one of the things I am really focused on, in addition to those two topics, is access to capital so that people can make these investments. There's sort of the new build problem. There's also the refurbishment and upgrade problem. And we need to make sure there's access to capital, especially for the low income communities. We're talking, we started tonight talking about access to this transition, making sure it's equitable. And I think that's a big problem that we've got to solve. And there's some really creative financing options out there. There's sort of the pay as you save, there's on-bill financing, right? There's a whole bunch of great policy options that we have. And we're going to be looking at those in a really targeted way in January 21 when we get back to the Capitol.
Excellent. And another question for you, Senator, and this one's from Leslie Glustrom, an audience member. She wants to know about what she calls the Pueblo Unit 3. It's also known as the Comanche 3, but she mentions that she doesn't feel the Native American tribes should have their name used on coal plants, but not a part of the question. What she wants to know is if we're going to be retiring that plant, and when it's only been about a sixth of the way through the life of it, and there have been problems with both the construction and reliable operation of the unit, should the utility continue to earn its full level of profit on that underappreciated portion of the plant? And should the utility be held partially accountable for this large coal plant mistake in Colorado?
Well, I think that's a decision that will be a big focus of review at the PUC, is what part of those stranded assets should be allowed to be recovered and which part should not. That is the PUC's job. What I would say is that, the part of the assets that are deemed used and useful, to my mind, would then be eligible for something like securitization. That's something that Xcel is looking at right now. The next ERP is going to be filed from Xcel in March. They're going to be looking at Pawnee. They're going to be looking at, all of their coal assets for potential retirement. And the Pueblo unit, I'm sure, is going to be front and center as they think about, okay, do we keep putting more operations and maintenance money into that, or do we pull the plug and then try to get a portion of that recovered? And that's exactly what we've built the PUC to look at and to make that determination.
And so here's another question. This one's from Eric Van Orden. He wants to know, is stranded natural gas generation assets were mentioned earlier in our conversation, assuming the electrification of transportation continues. Is there any thought going into how to balance continued investment in the safety of pipelines with some sort of pipeline optimization and peak load management? I'll give that question first to Dwayne, if you'd like to take a shot at it.
I'm not sure I understand enough about the question to answer it. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Pipeline optimization is not my thing.
Okay, sorry about that. Senator, would you like to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. I mean, I think, the ratepayers of the state of Colorado, that is my job. That is who I ran to look after. They have paid for lots of assets. One we just talked about, which is the coal plants around the state, and the one in Pueblo in particular. They have paid for thousands of miles of pipeline and reticulation and compression stations and everything that goes into the natural gas distribution systems in the state. Those are ratepayer assets, essentially, that have been paid for by the ratepayers. So yeah, we should optimize those. I mean, the same way that we talked about optimizing the transmission assets that will remain behind after we retire a coal plant, we should optimize the use of ratepayer assets, but we have to do it in as green a way, as quick as way as possible. So one idea might be to use our existing pipeline system to distribute commingled hydrogen gas to reduce the carbon footprint of our current use of natural gas. Mary Ann mentioned some of the industrial sectors. Super hard to decarbonize those. Hydrogen could be a really good option. If there's a way to reuse those assets, fantastic. So that's what I think of when I think about optimization. It's like, how do we decarbonize as quick as possible and for as low a cost as possible? And some of those assets could be super valuable in that transition.
And this one for Mary Ann, this is another question from our audience. How should utilities and just other power generators go about approaching communities that have historically been dependent on fossil fuels? They mentioned that approaching a rural community in Wyoming to talk about climate change won't work. Tell us a little bit about your experience with talking about people maybe outside of the usual energy transition circles and convincing them to come on board with this.
Well, I think a couple of things. One is that I think at this point, folks largely see the writing on the wall that coal isn't coming back. President Trump ran on the promise of bringing coal back, and that has not happened. And I think the writing is on the wall that coal plants are going to continue to retire and clean energy is going to continue to grow. And we, whether or not the climate crisis is part of the conversation, I think people realize the country is moving on, clean energy is cheaper, and don't want to be left behind and want to be part of that new 21st century clean energy economy. So I think talking about the economic opportunity that's out there and the need to embrace that and to plan for it is one way you can start the conversation. I think the other is the pollution from coal, whether it's farmers and ranchers that have lost their water, or folks in Appalachia living next to mountaintop removal mining sites where, again, the water is contaminated. I think folks have paid a heavy price for the reliance on coal in some communities, and there's a big opportunity to put folks to work in those communities doing restoration of abandoned mine lands, doing projects to clean up the water, doing the necessary work to provide the kind of environmental foundation for building new industries in those areas. So I think between the economic opportunity folks don't want to be left out of in the clean energy economy and the opportunity to kind of heal the land at home. Again, those require investments either from utilities or from our federal government or from states. But I think there are ways to start the conversation because I do think that folks see the world as changing.
Excellent. And thank you very much for that answer. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for coming. We are transitioning to the point where we are kind of going to move into breakthrough rooms, and they'll tell us a bit more about that. But just to summarize, I mean, I think some of the things that we've mentioned here, our panelists talked about, was that we have not always done a great job on some of these energy transition issues. But there are, I think, a lot of things to be excited about as we move forward on this transition. And more importantly, when we talk about energy justice, these social justice issues have been in the spotlight a lot lately, and that's probably only going to increase in the coming years. The energy sector is not immune to those concerns, and so whether you're in the business and regulating them or just observing the business, they're all issues that we're going to be talking about a lot, and hopefully taking issues to address. I just wanted to remind everybody that one of the things that we're talking about here is energy policy, and one of the most important ways that you can have a say on that is to go out and vote. So again, thank you everybody for joining us today. I think that this is a great discussion on energy policy and a just transition. And I'll turn it back over to our host, who will lead us to the next part of the event.
Yeah, thank you so much, Taylor. I would like to reiterate that I think you all had an awesome conversation today, Taylor. I think you did a particularly great job of connecting the dots between all of the panelists and all the different questions, both that you had prepared and both that were thrown at us from our audience, which I thought were awesome. I think also what I would highlight from this conversation is there was a big theme of integration, not just how we're going to integrate a bunch of different technologies or the 38 grids in the 11 Western states, but also how we're going to integrate all the stakeholders that are setting and creating this future forward. And what I love particularly about this panel is that they're not just representing themselves. They all clearly represent a lot of different and diverse communities that have both congruent and converging or diverging, excuse me, opinions on how we're going to get to this next step. So I just want to say thank you all so much again for participating. I think you guys did a fantastic job. As we transition to the breakout room portion, thank you. As we transition to the breakout room portion of the event, I would like to note that Switch Colorado will be sharing a survey in the chat box where you can fill out your LinkedIn profile if you did not do so during registration. We're using these kind of as a fun virtual business card for other attendees, and we'll be sharing a list of those who opt for the opportunity in an email later this week. Also in the survey is the link to donate to New Era, which we hope you will again consider. Voting is the most critical and unfortunately underutilized tool we have to build the future that we want. And New Era is doing the footwork to bring the next generation of voters and activists into the fold. As a few final thoughts together to kick off the conversation before we go to the breakout rooms, we'd love to hear what you think on our final 2 poll questions. That should be popping up any moment. Firstly, are you registered and committed to voting in 2020? Awesome. Wow, we have quite a committed group here today, which I'm so excited to see and hear. And hopefully since you all are committed and registered, I hope you take the opportunity to ask one of your friends, your family members to make sure they're registered and committed to voting as well. And as our second question, we'd like to know, in how many years do you predict the energy transition will snowball or gain enough political momentum to just kind of keep running on its own? Have a little bit of divergence here, so we'll make for some interesting conversation in the breakout rooms. But unfortunately, no one said never, so I'm happy we're all on the train to transitioning. I'd like to finally thank the panelists again, and as we transition into the smaller groups in separate rooms for the second portion of this event. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope that for these breakout rooms in the Zoom that we will be splitting up into shortly, you utilize this as an opportunity to get to know the other attendees and share thoughts about the conversation tonight. There will be a Switch team member in every session. Please feel free to interject with any thoughts, questions, or ideas that you'd like to share. Lastly, if you're dialed in both on audio and on video, please turn off your video so we don't have the issue where your video is in one room and your audio is in another. Thank you all so much again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.